Starting Friday noon, South Korea's loudspeaker propaganda broadcast resumed in 11 locations along the border.
Hello, explorers. It's me, Antonio D'Amico. This is Pointy Hat, and welcome to Tip of the Hat. That's right, it's time for another one of these. This is a show where I take something about playing or running D&D, I look at it, talk about it for a minute, and then give you something that can help you down the line with that thing, ideally. And you know how to read, so you know what we're doing. Let's talk dungeons. But also, really quick, I'll be at Gen Con, like soon, like very soon in fact. I'm going to send my human familiar there, say hi. Hi. Don't worry, I'll be taking control of his mind and seeing through his eyes. Hey, so it'll be like I'm there. Gen Con is happening the first week of August, and I'll have a panel with other D&D creators, and I'll be participating in a massive game called an Epic run by the Dungeon Dudes, and it has GDD on it, and D&D shorts, and me. And then I'll just be generally loitering around the convention hall for the whole thing. So please say hi if you're there and you see me. Okay, back to dungeons. Just had to let you know because I'm terrified of not knowing anyone there, so please say hi. For now, dungeons. I think if you play a lot of D&D or just RPGs in general, you're kind of desensitized to how ungodly weird the concept of a dungeon actually is. We all understand them, but if you spend like 3 seconds actually thinking of what a dungeon is, you kind of realize how strange they actually are. A dungeon is an enclosed space in which there are a series of challenges that people need to overcome in order to finish it, after which those that complete it will be rewarded with advancing the plot or by actual material rewards. Probably both. Okay, think about that for 3 seconds. That's wild. Imagine if we actually lived in a world where you can take on like American Ninja Warrior courses that are just sort of scattered around the country for profit and self-actualization. I think it's one of the rare aspects of D&D that has escaped the chase for verisimilitude in general. Nobody is out there trying to make dungeons truly make sense. People that care about narrative and verisimilitude, those people including me, will worry about how to make it so that the monsters that live within make sense and are not just random stuff pulled from a hat, or make it so that the puzzles and traps make sense with what the dungeon actually is, instead of whatever comes up on the first result of googling D&D traps for children 2 and up. But the very existence of dungeons is so alien that we just accept it. The closest real-world equivalent I can think of to a dungeon in the D&D sense is like maybe Egyptian tombs, and even then those are not built like dungeons are. Yes, they are filled with traps and dead ends, but the goal is not to conquer those. It's precisely the opposite. It's so that thieves don't get the goodies hidden within. There's also no concept of a boss or anything close to combat encounters in any Egyptian tomb. And to make it very clear, I'm not saying this is a negative. I think it's important to be aware of what we're doing when we're designing and playing a game, which is why I'm drawing attention to what dungeons actually are, but I have like little to no interest in making dungeons more realistic. So what am I interested in doing then? Well, dear little viewers, I want to help you make cool dungeons. But before we do that, we gotta examine the place dungeons occupy in D&D today and what place they used to occupy. But I don't feel comfortable delving into this topic blind. Get it? Delving? Dungeon delving? Anyway, if only we could get some insight. The need to peer into the future is not new. For generations, cultures across the globe and the planes have sought the power of clairvoyance. Tarot cards have been used as tools for this very purpose. But what if I told you that after millennia of mortals wishing for these conduits to peer into the future, that energy has managed to awaken the most powerful of these tools, animating them to transcend the bounds of normal tarot cards? That'd be cool. And guess what it is? Because they're real, and Hit Press is sponsoring me to tell you all about them. This is the animated D&D tarot deck, a tarot deck that moves in real life, like in your hand. And the deck comes with a guidebook that gives you ways to include a tarot deck in your TTRPG campaigns, and the illustrations are sick. And if you're not a DM, don't worry, they also have animated spells. That's right, the D&D spells you know and love, but animated. Perfect for players. Come on, they look like this, they look so pretty, and I have a code. That's right, if you use the code POINTYHATPP, POINTYHATPP like at Point Press, you get $10 off of your order of the tarot box set and the animated spell bundles. So if that sounds intriguing, go and check it out in the description. The link is down below. Don't forget the code. And with the knowledge of the future in our hands, let's go back into the dungeon. So there are basically two camps when it comes to dungeons. One I'm gonna call the dungeon crawl camp, and the other one I'm gonna call the dungeon level camp. A dungeon crawling game is a game of D&D, or any RPG that calls itself a dungeon crawl, where most of the playtime is spent inside of a dungeon. These are literally multi-level dungeons. I'm talking like an underground mall of dungeons, 7-floor deep dungeons. And the whole fun of the game is to get to the next floor. Some floors are bigger than others, some have more combat than others, some are safe floors where players can rest and lick their wounds, and some are boss floors. But the dungeon is basically the entirety of the game. Time spent outside of the dungeon is either to prep to enter the dungeon, like buying equipment and potions and 10-foot poles that you use to top the floor in front of you in case of like spike traps or thrown darts or whatever. And if you remember playing this way, you qualify for a senior citizen discount. Or time spent outside of the dungeon is spent traveling to the next dungeon. Most of these games are loot based, and magic items are like just as important as level ups are when it comes to measuring your character's strength. This is considered very old school. It almost feels war game-y, war game adjacent, not true war games, but kind of related. But this style of play is by no means dying. It is less popular, but not dying. There are very modern video games nowadays that replicate this. Somehow it feels like dungeon crawls have had more of a staying power in the East rather than the West. Etrian Odyssey is a relatively new series that does this, and Shin Megami Tensei is still going strong, and they do this often when they're not busy making people trip up when they pronounce the name of the series. But D&D is very much not trending in the dungeon crawl direction. We can talk for ages as to why this is the case. Is it because of the influence of video games like The Legend of Zelda? Is it the emphasis on role-playing rather than combat and puzzle and exploration? Is it because dungeon crawls, with their extreme reliance on grid-based traversal and not just combat, are just better suited for a medium like video games where constant calculus can be done in the blink of an eye by a computer and not by a person? Who knows? The point is, D&D is very much moving away from this to a new way of playing where dungeons are very much still a thing, but they are smaller, more contained, more story relevant, and take more of a secondary place to the main narrative the group is collectively telling. The rise of the 5-room dungeon, what I would consider the most popular approach to dungeon making in 5e, is emblematic of this. Dungeons are seen as like a break of pace for a game that is more about talking amongst the party, talking with NPCs, making big narrative decisions, and traveling around. Dungeons in this new style of play take the place of the last obstacle to overcome in whatever arc your party is playing. Yes, I think of D&D campaigns as being divided by arcs. Yes, I am a weeb. No, I will never admit it. Wait. Games that run dungeons like this tend to go this way. The party travels for a while, they face all kinds of encounters on the road and find themselves confronted with a plot hook that the DM has ever so subtly put in their way. They roleplay, hash out what to do about said plot hook, maybe make some narrative choices, talk to some NPCs, decide on what to do, and then they'll be told that if they want to return the snuggle of necromantic power to the ruler of the zombie kingdom, they will have to go into the spooky graveyard dungeon. And that's when the dungeon comes in. 2 to 5 sessions later, the party will hopefully emerge out of the dungeon snuggie in hand. And then it's right back to role-playing and concluding the arc. And then, the end. Now, I'm not gonna beat around the bush.
I beat around the bush all the time.
I am firmly in the second camp. I am very much a dungeon as part of the game rather than dungeon as the entirety of the game. And now that we've defined that, I'll say that this guide is very much geared towards that playstyle. Both because it's the one I use, but also because it's the one that is most popular and therefore the one that most people will find useful. Even hardcore dungeon crawlers can take something away from this video. Why? Because, I mean, I want people to DM as much as anybody else playing D&D. I literally make videos to help both DMs and players, but I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Creating a full dungeon from scratch, that's hard. It takes time, and even if you're willing to put in the time, I think it's easy to go wrong with it. So I'm hoping that this video will help. So how do I plan to do that? Well, I'm gonna take you on a little dungeon of my own in video form to show you how I make dungeons. My method is less strict and by the numbers than the 5-room dungeon method. It's more like a set of rules to help you create dungeons, which means it's 100% compatible with the 5-room dungeon method if that's the one you like. You can still use my method in conjunction with that one, or you can just use this one. So what can you expect of this method? Let's set some expectations. The first, as I already said, is that this won't be a dungeon crawl dungeon. Those are fine, those are valid, you're valid. But it's just not what I run, so I can't help with that. The second is that my dungeons can be considered short by some people's standards. I tend to have like a 4 to 5 session limit to my dungeons. I just find it tedious for a singular dungeon to last longer than that. I feel like people need a break from it after that long, or at least my players do. But you can always make a dungeon longer if you or your party just absolutely love never seeing the sun. The third is that I enjoy a lot of variety in my dungeons. If you're going in expecting like maybe 1 spike trap and then 10 combat encounters, those are not the dungeons I tend to run. And finally, and this is the most important one, I define my approach to dungeon design as both video game inspired and also theme park-esque. I work in game dev and I've studied it, so I apply a lot of game design principles to my dungeons. But I also really care about theming and creating a vibe. And when I say that, I don't mean I spend 5 minutes describing each room, but rather I use game mechanics to contribute to the theme of the dungeon. You'll see. Okay, that's enough setting of expectations. Let's get into this pointy hat dungeon making method. I will be doing this as a
numbered list
because those scratch my tiny lizard brain. Neuron activation goes through the roof when I hear number 1. I'm sad. That being said, number 1, select a theme. I would argue this is the most important step. You might think this means select a setting, and you're only partially wrong. That's part of it, but not all of it. I start thinking of my dungeons in terms of themes. Is this dungeon about undeath, about death, about healing, about lies, about friendship? These might seem very highbrow, but stay with me here. Let's say that our theme is lies. Cool. What can we do with that? Lies, artifice, illusions. We can make a dungeon that is set in a carnival ride, a house of mirrors, or we can make a dungeon that is some sort of haunted magical ball of masks. See, we've decided on a setting based on our theme. I like lies as a theme, so I'll continue on with it for this example. And I'll say that the actual setting of the dungeon is a carnival, with different rides being all part of the dungeon. Listen, I love circuses, trains, and boats. My interests have not changed since I was age 7. If I have a chance to put any of those anywhere, I will, so please indulge me. Now that we have a theme, let's go to number 2, pick a mechanic. This is where that game design part of my method kicks in. Mechanic is a very game design word, along with, I don't know, action, space, feature, creep, crunch, torturing the art team, all of those. So what do I mean by mechanic? Well, I'm looking for a system in the game that is gonna let me express my theme through game mechanics. Oh god, I'm reading the script and this feels so like insufferably game designy. Please stick with me here. I'm looking for a system of rules in the game that is going to convey the theme of the dungeon, both to drive it home, but also to make the players really feel that theme. I think people are pretty good about doing this when they talk about narrative, but less so with mechanics. Like, you can make a dungeon about death and have zombies and necromancers and have NPCs talk about sad deaths they experienced, but they often don't take that into the realm of the mechanics of the game, or when interacting with the rules of the game. I'm going to give you 2 examples. Imagine if the theme I chose was sleep. I could then choose mechanics that connect to the concept of sleep in the game. I could mess with short rests. I could mess with rolling hit dice during those short rests. I could play with exhaustion levels, and of course, the sleep condition. See, we can very much use game mechanics to express a theme. For our little lie example that I outlined in step 1, I'm gonna use a very simple mechanic, illusions in D&D. Players are very familiar with those, and I have so many spells to choose from. Enemies can use those, the dungeon can use those, I can mess with stuff like perception checks. That's a super easy way to use mechanics to reinforce your theme. So now that we have that, what do? Number 3, select a goal. This one is pretty self-explanatory, and also kind of hard to miss, but this is a guide, so I gotta say it. Select a goal for your dungeon. How do your players win? Do they need to reach the end? Do they need to defeat the boss at the end of the dungeon? Do they need to find something hidden inside of the dungeon? Do they need to get someone through the dungeon in one piece? As you can see, there are indeed more goals for a dungeon than just kill the monster in the big empty circular room. Having some variety to your dungeons might be a good idea, especially if you run them quite often. If your game has a very video gamey setup, like find the 7 mystical teacups of the elements in the 7 dungeons, it might be good to switch up goals once your players have grown accustomed to the baseline setup. Instead of having all mystical teacups just laying somewhere after the big boss room, have one of them sit in the open behind a force field and make the dungeon about deactivating that force field. Okay, so now we know why players are going into this dungeon. Let's talk about what they actually do for the majority of their time there. Number 4, add a variety of encounters. So we have a theme, we have a mechanic to express that theme, we have a goal. Let's create some situations that can lead you to express those mechanics. These are called encounters. Now, here's a little known D&D fact that people seem to forget. Encounter does not mean combat exclusively. That's right, there are other types of encounters. Did you know? Because sometimes it sure feels like it isn't the case. I tend to find combat-only dungeons with the occasional trap thrown in extremely boring. Combat is fun for a while, but you need hills and valleys in your dungeon. You need to keep a good pace, and a good pace cannot be kept by constant fighting 24/7 all the time forever. That's where different encounters come in. So let's go over them really quick. Number A, combat. You know what this is. This is a combat encounter. You don't need me to explain this. It's something you set up for your players to fight a set of baddies. No need to bore you. Moving on.
Everybody say something, keep it going.
Number B, trap and puzzle. Yes, I'm rolling them both into one because, spoiler alert, I run all my traps as puzzles. So let's get some definitions. A trap is something set up for others to fall into. Step on a tile and darts fly off, hitting your little guy. A puzzle is something set up for others to solve. You gotta step on the tiles in the right order to open the door. Now, why run traps as puzzles? I could probably make a whole video about this, and maybe someday I will, but long story short, I find that traps tend to be boring, or at least they can be. If D&D was a movie, maybe it'll be cool to show how someone dodges the darts, but at the table, it's rolling a die, it's rolling a deck save, that's it. You can maybe make it slightly more interesting with, I don't know, consequences, but the action of falling or succeeding at avoiding a trap is just, it's not very engaging. It doesn't take any actual skill from your players, even if they use their actual character's skills to avoid it. I will heavily advise you to start thinking about what the player actually does when interacting with your encounters rather than what it looks like in your head, because some stuff is fun to watch but not fun to play. To make them interesting, I run my traps as disguised puzzles. Here's an example. The room the heroes are standing in is filling with water quickly, and they will drown if they don't do something. They can tear the protective cover out of the valve that releases the water, but they have to figure out how the console works, and now the players are engaging in a Bioshock pipe puzzle to stop them from dying. You've suddenly turned this trap into an actually exciting and challenging test for your players that requires actual skill to solve, rather than just taking turns rolling to beat a DC. It's certainly more exciting than roll a check. Anyway, you're welcome to run them however you please. Be mad in the comments about that. I'm just here to let you know that this is another encounter type. And speaking of, number C, roleplay. Here it is, the often forgotten encounter type when it comes to dungeons. Roleplay encounters are all about talking with someone to get them to do something for you. How you go about that is for you to choose. There's a guardian that stops your progress and demands your help in exchange for letting you through. Do you intimidate them? Do you help them? Do you talk to them and figure out what their deal is? That's RP, baby. Okay, neat. We've gone through all different encounter types. Now that that's fresh in your minds, we gotta figure out a way to insert our mechanic into these encounter types. Back to our theme of lies and our mechanic of illusions, a common encounter that uses that mechanics to express that theme might be a fight in a hall of mirrors, where players have to use the mirrors to discern which enemies are reals and which ones are fake illusions. But if they're looking at the mirrors, they're not looking at the enemy, which means the enemy gets advantage. Exciting! A trap with the theme of lies might be the easiest incorporation of the theme here. Maybe the players need to find a key, but it's in a room filled with hundreds of thousands of illusory keys. They could spend a lifetime manually checking, or figure out a way to disable the crystals that are displaying the illusory keys. Finally, a roleplay encounter featuring illusions and the theme of lies also basically writes itself. The NPC is lying. The NPC does not appear to be what they originally are. Maybe this NPC is the one that set them into the dungeon in the first place and they had hidden motives for doing so. Encounters are the way to communicate your theme and play with the mechanic that you've selected to convey it. This is the meat of the dungeon, and players will remember encounters leading up to the boss more than the boss itself, most of the time at least, because that's most of the dungeon. But they are not only relevant to my whole idea of theme and mechanics, they are also, you know, vital for actual dungeon design. Dungeons are there to deplete the resources of your players before they get to the final boss. This might be news to some of you, but that's the main reason why we have dungeons with encounters and places where players will spend resources. Because if you don't, players can just waltz up to the boss and go Nova on them using all their abilities and all their resources in the beginning stages of the fight and burning through your boss in one fell swoop. Balancing exactly how many of those resources is tricky, particularly because you are not actually the one spending them and players can choose to spend them however they please. So here's my trick. If players get to the boss with more than one hit dice still in their hit dice pool, you might have gone a little bit too easy on them. I've seen some people say that you can measure if your dungeon was too hard or too easy looking at how many spell slots they have left, and I think this is garbage advice.
Mama, this is garbage.
First, not all classes have spells. Second, spellcasters vary widely in spell slots and spell slot recovery. And third, and most important, some players play more cautiously and conservatively with their spell slots than others. There's way too many variables for that to be your way of tracking if your dungeon is hard. But all classes have hit dice and they also scale in level, so try tracking those. I can give you a specific length or a specific number of encounters that dungeons should have. You will find that by running your dungeons and adjusting them as you go and as you make new ones. But if you absolutely need a start, I found that 4 to 6 encounters is a good start for a dungeon plan. Okay, so we have a theme, we have a mechanic, we have a goal, we have the encounters to get to that goal. There is just one final point. Number 5. Give your dungeon an ending. Notice how I didn't call this a boss. A dungeon needs an end, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a boss. It often is, and most of the dungeons I run have one because I like bosses, and players do too. But it could very much be a skill challenge or a final puzzle. The most important aspect for your dungeon ending, if you're following this method, is that your dungeon ending must be the culmination of your theme and your mechanics. This sounds hard, but it actually is very easy if you've been following this guide in order. You're gonna take all or most of the ways you've expressed your theme through mechanics in your dungeon, and you're gonna dump that bucket on your ending. This is a very common principle of game design where a mechanic is introduced to the players in a safe, or safe-ish, area so they can learn it, aka your encounters, and now they're ready to fully engage with it in a not-so-safe area, like a boss battle, for example. For our theme of lies and illusion mechanics, let's say that you had the aforementioned Hall of Mirror fights, but also one where the enemy would divide itself in several illusory copies of itself, and the players had to figure out which one was the real one by using AoEs or simple attacks. Cool. You're gonna take those two expressions of the illusions mechanic and give those to your boss. Your players will love this because they know how to engage with this now. They know what they must do, and they can focus on fighting the boss and putting the knowledge that they have acquired throughout the dungeon to the test while they battle. I can assure you, this is cool. This gives really, really good results at the table, at least in my experience. And if you've been a very, very good boy and followed all the numbers in my little numbered list, you should have a pretty snazzy dungeon by now. Look at you! Oh, wait, what? What do you mean you weren't actually writing a dungeon as you were simultaneously watching this video? Oh man, that blows. I guess you're gonna have to go back and listen to the advice again and pause, write your thing, then go back to the video, yada yada yada. Man, that blows. If only someone had written this whole thing in an easy to follow format that you can use to write your own dungeon. Better yet, it'd be cool to see this method actually reflected in, you know, an actual dungeon that you could use, or at least read to see it in action. Good thing I did. That's right. The Pointy Hat Dungeon Making Guide is in the description of this very video for 100% certified free. And that's not all. You might not have seen it in case you skipped the Feywild video, in which case, how dare you? That video took ages. But in that video, I made a dungeon using this method before I ever explained my method. It's not just a dungeon, but a whole adventure with a dungeon included inside of it. And it's in the description of this very video for you to use. I use illusions and also sleep to really drive the Fey theme across on that one. So if you want some inspo, you can check that out too. Both links are in the description of this very video you're watching. So go out there, get some graph paper, some dry erase boards, and some markers, and put your friends through a series of torture chambers for fun. And now that's it. That's the end of the video. You did it. I am proud of you. This more game design-y videos are always a gamble for me. I legit don't know if y'all like them, but I find this stuff to be, you know, quite hard to grasp if you haven't poured like hours into game design or into studying this sort of stuff. If you do like these, do let me know in the comments, and do let me know your dungeon concepts because I would love to hear them, especially if this method has inspired you to create some fun thematic dungeons. I'm off to work on more stuff, but I'm also off to Gen Con. I'll be there, and this is my first convention in the US, and certainly my first convention as any sort of content creator, so I really don't know what to expect. Say hi if you see me around. All right, I'm off to pack. I'll see you soon. Don't overpack for any trips. Triple check your gate if you're flying. Get to the airport at least 2 hours before the flight leaves. I do 3 if I have to check bags, or if it's an international flight, just be sure. Okay, enough travel tips. See ya. Bye-bye. See you at Gen Con if you're going. See you here if you're not. Great. Bye-bye. Bye-bye now. Bye. Mwah.